Hello dear friends, today is the 4th of July, Friday, Independence Day in the United States of America, but we will celebrate later, we will celebrate together with victory. And so far there are so many incredible events that I decided to make a rather urgent issue, which, remember the events that will be. Discuss now led to today's conversation on the phone of Trump and Zelensky. I do not know yet about the results of this conversation, but I know that it has become a consequence of everything that I will tell you about now. So literally the next day, after Washington suddenly stopped all military aid in Ukraine, a scandal broke out. A large number of mass media, and what is most remarkable, even those that are close to the Republican Party, they came out with sharply critical articles. Even the New York Post was distinguished. This is a newspaper that belongs to Rupert Nordic, one can say a friend of Donald Trump, and even Fox News was outraged. Well, about what they wrote and said, I will tell you a little later. It is worth it when we will specifically discuss these issues. Well, so now simply, briefly, so that you understand the context of the events. There was a scandal in the media, and here, just a few hours after that, there were rumors in Washington that these were some ill-intentioned. People, in addition, people of the second, third bureaucratic composition, and the head of the Pentagon, not to mention the White House, had no idea about it. I told you about one of these people in the previous video, which was immediately pointed out first. Here he is to blame. This is Colby, the third person in the Pentagon. But then it turned out that the level of this person was too low to just stop the aid in his own way. And to turn the planes around and even take the aid that had already been delivered to the base, in particular to the Rzeszów base in Poland. It is necessary to start looking further, digging further, and today I think the BBC shot the first, which is to blame. The main culprit is the Minister of Defense Hexett. Well, it doesn't go any further, the trail doesn't stretch any further. I think it is worth trying to stretch this trail, which we will do now. I myself learned about this conspiracy theory, although in the current situation in Washington everything can be. He controls like an aristocracy, and an idiot with powers can do something that will not be possible for the most super professional and malicious. And so, General Hodges, whom I extremely respect, but he is not trained in cunning behind-the-scenes maneuvers, told the following story that it was all invented by this very Colby. The Pentagon is a mess, it really is, the most high-ranking people, who have been sitting there for years, if not decades, have been filmed. Instead of them, or no one, or appointed morons, well, to become the current Minister of Defense, who, in theory, should be the smartest of them. Therefore, what is happening there and how to do it, in general, there are no people who understand how paper should circulate. And there is a whole conspiracy, it turns out to be a secret science. And only this Colby, he knew how paper moves and how it can make a strange turn, and using this, he inspired the whole thing. With all respect to General Koshchitsa, I think that this is superficial. The first one was found by the goats, they decided that he would be, but then it turned out that all the same, not enough. The matter went to the Minister of Defense. The Minister of Defense is a person who has no idea what he should do. In fact, I mean as a Minister of Defense, not as some kind of guy or duck temporarily. Or a clown who temporarily takes someone's place. That is, he signs anything. Sometimes they say after the glass or two, he holds the blow well, therefore he could do anything. That's how they stopped. That is, the idea was that President Trump has absolutely nothing to do with it. But Rubio, who is both the Secretary of State and at the same time an assistant to national security, the very one who should monitor all the main papers and decisions that are made in various ministries and departments, particularly in the Pentagon, he was so busy on that day or that hour with the State Department's affairs that he missed this vital paper from the Pentagon. Therefore, he did not read it, did not receive it, did not report it to Trump. In short, the situation is how I evaluate it. Of course, Hexett has nothing to do with it. And Colby, despite the fact that he is now trying to make such an evil conspirator, a bad guy, he also could not, with all his efforts, carry out such an operation. I think it was a domestic preparation of the President of the United States personally. He planned a telephone conversation with Putin, which then took place yesterday. And the day before yesterday, he decided to make him a royal gift, so to speak, to sweeten the pill, like, look what I'm doing to you, what a gift I'm making you. Well, at least throw me a bone from the table. And so the telephone conversation took place, and it turned out that there would be no bones. Instead of bones, there was, well, I would say, insult, humiliation, public insult. The President of the United States of Kremlin, personally Putin, is growing. And this is understandable because gopniks, they are such people, if you give in to them once, that's it, a dead end. If they feel weak, they will get to the point where they will wipe their feet or try to do it in any case.
Человек, которого в свое время называли бледной молью и окурком, сейчас он президент Раши, на каком-то форуме находится в Раши и со сцены общается с многочисленной публикой, обсуждает какие-то там разговоры, проблемы.
Volin, a shark, now he is the president of Russia, is on some kind of forum in Russia, and from the stage communicates with a large audience, discusses some talks, problems, and suddenly, allegedly, but this is all planned out, and suddenly out of nowhere, the president of the United States is on the wire. He urgently wants to talk, and this one is sitting while talking to the public, that is all. This was allegedly not prepared in advance, and here Pupkin says, excuse me friends, we have a very important conversation, but what to do, we will have to take this call, because they are starting to get offended, and the public understanding, giggling, well okay, the hell with him. So that the children in Washington do not get offended, go, our dear Blednaya Mall, talk to them. And then Trump, by the way, announced on his social network that I would have a phone conversation with Putin. There was a phone conversation, and every half an hour I went to the social network, to Trump's page, to see what happened there. 5 hours have passed, not a word. That is, Trump was probably in shock at what happened there, and the White House. That is, the best PR agents of the United States of America could not blind some candy, more or less convenient to say, which could be shown to the public that here is our hero, an artist of negotiations, achieved something. The Russians immediately released what had happened. They did not care about the opinion of Washington and the American voter. In short, if you want to blind it all, then separate comments came from Washington, but Trump was silent for a long time, until in the morning they began to ask him in the evening about the plane. So Trump asked the question, Vladimir, it is necessary to stop the war, and the day before he stopped the help to Ukraine. Well, where else? That's it, we have to stop. Here's Vladimir for you. To which Vladimir replied, we are making efforts. We know these efforts from you in a diplomatic policy, but we will achieve our goals to the end. And that was the answer, a brief statement of the question, we must end the war. The answer, we will fight or wage this war to the end. This means that, in fact, the transformation of Ukraine into a vassal, the change of government, the change of regime, so to speak. In general, Ukraine as a sovereign state ceases to exist. And then, apparently, Donald Trump began to understand something. Previously, he gave 2 weeks, he hoped for something, holy simplicity, what naivety, and so it happened. That is, it was in fact, apparently, perceived by him as an insult. In any case, this is how he sounded when he was leaving Washington on his plane. He was flying, in my opinion, to the state of Iowa, and he was asked a question and he looked completely annoyed. He said sharply that there was no progress. There was not. He said that Putin did not want the end of the war. Finally, the presidency needed Trump for 150 days to achieve this great secret, and he has the impression that Putin is not there. Where is he not? Why is he not there? I don't know. It was a sad speech. Then he was asked about the supply of weapons. He said that Biden has emptied out our Pentagon borders and we have to think about ourselves. It was all Biden's fault. He gave us all the weapons, but nothing was left. That's why he was angry. Then he came back late. Apparently, the meeting was not in Adi. There were rumors that very few people were sent there. Apparently, he was very upset about this because when he came back, he looked very angry. It was hard for him to hold his anger. He added something. He said, "We are working with Ukrainians. We will try to help them, and I will have a telephone conversation with Zelensky." And Putin, that's it. Putin doesn't want to. Finally, Putin doesn't want peace. Well, with that, we have come to this day. That is, my version of all these events is the White House, that is, personally Trump and his. Apparently, they made this decision to stop the help of Putin as a candy, hoping for mutuality. There was no mutuality. First, even before the conversation with Putin, when this scary criticism fell from the American media, they chose Colby as a scapegoat. But now, after such a disappointing Trump conversation with Putin, it was necessary to raise the stakes. What is there? Some Colby spoiled the telephone conversation with Putin. The matter reached Hexett. Now the main goat of defection is drawn. And with this, negotiations were supposed to take place. What did I hope for? That is, I repeat, I heard that they were over, but I do not know the result. Now, at this moment, I will record this video. I will tell you in detail so that you and I can imagine what the negotiations can be about in real life and what can happen next. So after help was stopped, not just stopped, the planes were deployed and everything went back to the edge of the Pentagon, so to speak. The next day an article is published in the New York Post, a newspaper, as I said, a report by Murdoch. It also belongs to Fox News, it also belongs to Wall Street Journal. That is, these are the main, so to speak, means of mass information that enter Trump's pool. There are practically no other benefactors except for some sweet languages. So what does it say? This is an editorial article. What does it say? Close in theory to Trump, to the Republicans, to the magic of the New York Post. The Pentagon's decision to stop Ukraine's aid is a huge mistake. President Donald Trump must cancel it as soon as possible. This news, as expected, caused delight in the Kremlin, where the official representative of SAND called out, "The less weapons are supplied to Ukraine, the closer the end of the special military operation. That is, the faster we throw Ukrainians, the faster Russia will be able to crush them." However, the hand-to-hand Trump or Defense Minister Hexett were calculated in the assessment of risks. The consequences of Russia conquering its neighboring country will be far more painful than the incomplete stock of weapons. It seems that Putin should thank for this gift of hawks in the administration, who are against China. According to a message last month, the Deputy Defense Minister for Political Affairs Colby made a decision to stop the supply. That is, it was last month in June somewhere, but not in the last days, and all of it was lying there and suddenly started to work. Convinced that China represents a much greater threat than Russia, Colby has long claimed that the United States must redirect resources from Ukraine to contain the Taiwan war. What kind of war is there in Taiwan? What are they going to contain there? This is a false choice, the newspaper colleagues note. The point is not to help Ukraine or contain China, but to help Ukraine and contain China. Beijing is a threat. That is why we must continue to arm Kiev to the teeth. In addition, China may soon become much less aggressive. President Xi Jinping, according to reports, is in poor health. Quickly loses loyal supporters in his own government and may leave his post, since the Communist Party of China understands that it is leading the country into a catastrophe. Then we will move on to China, and you will understand, the echoes of this thought laid in this paragraph. The best way to make China and all the enemies of America understand that open aggression will not be tolerable is to ensure the failure of Russia's attempts to conquer Ukraine. If you allow Kiev to fall, Washington will look like an unreliable ally who can be frightened or seduced, so I want to add a cheap deal. They understand everything, and make them refuse to fight. This puts Taiwan in direct danger and undermines its security and our authority as the most powerful military force in the world. At the same time as the Pentagon provokes Trump, Putin doubles its stakes. Last weekend, Russia sent 500 unmanned aerial missiles to Ukrainian cities. This is the largest air attack since the beginning of the war. If the priceless defense system that we provide will be reduced, Ukrainian troops and civilian population will suffer heavy losses and will gradually lose their territories. And the United States will look weaker both morally and militarily. The armament of Ukraine is in the interests of America. The Trump team must recognize this, and as soon as possible. And then there were rumors about that this is ill-intentioned, the administration does not know anything about it, and so on, as I said at the very beginning. Then comes the sign, that is, I do not tell you everything that is written, I choose typical things that reflect more. Vividly what many have written, and so an article comes out in the New York Times which shows that the halt of military aid to Ukraine just became part of a wider campaign, which is conducted by the administration and which contributes to the Kremlin in its aggression against Ukraine, but first by more subtle methods and less noticeable publicly. What is this about? This is about policies in the field of sanctions against Russia. The newspaper notes that Trump did not introduce this year, well, that is, the beginning of the presidency, any new restrictions on Russia. In fact, they allowed Moscow to acquire the money and materials necessary for it in the war with Ukraine. Since the return of Trump to office in January, the United States has not introduced any new sanctions, and this must be done in order to support at least the previous ones. Because the Russians are looking for holes in the sanctions that have been announced for a long time, they need to be removed, new sanctions are needed, the administration does nothing. As a result, there are opportunities for new supplies, for new substitute companies that send funds to Russia and critically important components, including computer chips and military equipment, which otherwise should be, according to the sanctions introduced, unavailable for the Kremlin. The newspaper recalls that during the presidency of Biden, thousands of sanctions were introduced against all kinds of organizations, companies, and individuals. But the approach of Trump in general, in the broadest sense of the word, in all respects, the approach of Trump to economic policy and negotiations, it is to apply pressure to get the levers of influence and use them to achieve the best results, as he says, a deal from the position of power. But the newspaper notes, for some reason, as Ketlev writes in the New York Times, Trump does not want to have any influence on Putin. Although the conversation you remember with the election campaign, he will say to Zelensky, "Go to negotiations with Putin, otherwise I will punish, I will ask for help." And he will say to Putin, "And if you do not engage in negotiations, then I will arm Zelensky to the teeth." And in practice, it turns out 150 days, it turns out, as the cases of words testify, Trump does not need any lever of influence on Putin. And when Lindsey Graham says how much they tell us, Kiev came up with this speech that we will conduct this bill on sanctions, where these 500% tariffs in relation to China, as it is supposed, and India if they will trade further with Russia, and this is needed as a tool for our president to put pressure on Putin, then all this turns out to be just words, just a bluff. Because, as New York Times writes on the basis of the analysis conducted, what was with Biden, what is or is not with Trump, there is no need. Trump does not need any lever of influence on Putin. In general, the Biden administration has introduced more than 6,200 sanctions against physical individuals, companies, courts, planes related to Russia. In the last 2 weeks of the Biden administration, the U.S. has increased the pressure even more, introducing almost 3 times more sanctions than on average in a month. As a result, this pressure begins to weaken. The Russians are making mistakes. An analysis of trade documents conducted by the New York Times revealed more than 130 companies in mainland China, including Hong Kong, which are advertising the immediate sale of limited computer chips to Russia. None of these companies are under sanctions. 130 companies, do you know how many they can put up? Here is such an article. That is, once again, this is not some case where a drunken defense minister signed wrongly, and some third person in the Pentagon suddenly came up with a terrible diversion against the administration, stopped the supply of military aid to Ukraine. Stopping is just the last manifestation, so to speak, in the public almost openly of that company, that policy, and I would say that special operation that has been carried out since the first days of the administration in the White House. And it was, so to speak, like a cherry on the cake in this pre-stopping of aid. The Wall Street Journal recalls that Trump and his administration inherited from the previous administration $3.85 billion, $3.8 billion from Pentagon reserves. That is, you can take this amount from the Pentagon reserves and supply it to Ukraine. However, so far Trump's administration has not taken a penny from this, although the money lies. Please do not make any decisions. Trump's administration has also not appealed to Congress for additional funding. Separate programs entitled Initiative to Help Ukraine in the Security Service. That is, the initiative to help is the placement of orders at the enterprises of the VPC, which will be ready in some time and transferred to Ukraine. By the way, they are still being made, working on them, and they will continue. That is, America will have these weapons, ammunition, which are now being made on this initiative. And, in theory, these deliveries should have continued until the end of the 28th year. And the sums there are decent. They're every year somewhere. Well, this year there is a decline, and then from the next year it begins. More than $10 billion a year. So here's the question. Trump administration, these already paid, manufactured weapons and ammunition, are they going to supply to Ukraine or not? And why don't they do anything with these $3.85 billion? By the way, I haven't seen analysts lately who, during the Biden administration, filled the Ukrainian space with information, scolding the Biden administration for hiding some money. They don't want to supply something, pipette supplies. Where is the disclosure of the Trump administration? In particular, why don't we spend $3.85 billion, which Biden left for you? What's going on? In short, what happened is clear. And after that, a phone conversation with Putin took place, after which Trump said, "I am very disappointed in today's conversation with President Putin because I don't think he is there." Where is he there? I'm just saying that I don't think he wants to stop. It's a shame. He is a poor man. Doesn't he have any advisors who could have told him a long time ago that he doesn't want to stop? Is it really such a big secret in the White House? Trump also told journalists that they were planning to talk to Zelensky on Friday. When he was asked about the stopover, the president said, "We are supplying weapons." Do you feel the difference? That is, just a few hours before that, he said that we should think about ourselves, our interests, first of all. Biden has torn apart our borders, and now he says it was already after the return, in my opinion, from Iowa. We are supplying weapons, and we are working with them, and we will try to help. That is a twist of this internal scandal, a search for misguidance, a hole, apparently, under the carpet of various bulldogs, various clans. And put, in fact, the White House on the verge of failure. Because, well, I repeat, I can't imagine in my worst dreams that Hexett gave such an indication, not related to something in the White House. That is, a person has no idea at all what is happening there and what are his real obligations in such serious things. That is, without covering himself with the appropriate place from subsequent acceleration and punishment, he was obliged to cover all this. But Trump continued, but well, you know, we have to make sure that we have enough for ourselves. Trump urged the Russian president to stop the war in Ukraine, but Putin rejected this attempt, according to information from the Kremlin. This is written by The Hill. Putin told Trump that Russia would not back down from its military goals in Ukraine. This is what Yury, Putin's closest assistant, said. That's all. So how much time do we have to mark with you that Trump's recent attempts to use his own tricks, or what else is he going to use to make Putin stop the aggression in Ukraine in 24 hours, are all useless, and he did not even notice the situation when it escalated so much. That the Kremlin began to expose the President of the United States literally in a funny light. Did Trump change, and did it really open his eyes to what was actually happening? And if it was, then I think this is due to the unexpected revelations of the Foreign Minister of China, Wang Yi.
министра иностранных дел Китая Ван И,
which he made as a code of the talks of the main diplomat of the European Union, Carlos, and it was in Brussels.
главного дипломата Евросоюза Каллас, и это было в Брюсселе.
Now Wang Yi is holding a tour of Europe. In about 2 weeks, there should be a summit between China and the EU, where global issues will be discussed.
Где будут обсуждаться глобальные вопросы.
The EU has a number of serious claims to China because of its support for Russia, then by rarely land medals.
Китаю из-за его поддержки России, потом по редкоземельным металлам.
The EU considers a whole list of sanctions that threaten to be introduced in the 2018 package for China-Russia cooperation.
За содействие Китаю, России.
On this background, the meeting with Mrs. Callows took place, during which Wang Yi blew up a bomb.
С госпожой Каллас, в ходе которого Ван И взорвал бомбу.
I will now quote and tell you all this with a reference to the South China Morning Post, that is, to the Chinese source. This will probably be the most correct, because it excludes the wrong interpretation of what Wang Yi said by Europeans or Americans. In general, the Chinese are exposing what happened. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said to the high-ranking diplomat of the European Union that Beijing, attention, is a historical statement. Beijing cannot afford to lose to Russia and Ukraine, because it fears that in this case the United States will shift all its attention to Beijing. This statement made by Kai Kallas confirms that many in Brussels believe that Beijing is a real opposition, but that Beijing has never spoken out and has always denied the public. That is, once again, Beijing cannot afford to lose to Russia in Ukraine, because if Russia loses, the war ends in Ukraine and the United States shifts to China. As, by the way, Mr. Colby dreamed of and a number of other, how to call them, Chinese yachts. This is the most terrible danger. Here it is noted again, the Chinese themselves note that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs regularly and earlier declared to China that China is not a party in the war between Russia and Ukraine. That China is above them and wants to play the role of an objective peacemaker. And when the official face of the EU, who participated in this meeting with Wang Yi heard this statement, they were amazed by the frankness of Wang Yi's statements. Frankly speaking, I was amazed. Still, I have some experience of communicating with the living Chinese. Moreover, he is not just a Chinese, he was a Chinese intelligence officer established in our center in Moscow. They knew that he was a Chinese intelligence officer. In addition, he was characterized as an aggressive person, a person who was determined to win. And what is a victory? It is a collection, receiving secret information from foreigners. And so we played with him, cat and mouse. He tried to collect information from me. I tried to collect information from him. He tried to collect information from me. I tried to collect information from him, and so on. A separate story, and he was also a correspondent of one of the leading Chinese newspapers in the United States. It was his second term. His first term was in New York at UN, then in Washington. That is, the most experienced person not in the street. And I must say that I did not notice any subtlety in his behavior, in his speeches. I will tell you, when I served in the Odessa district, I had a senior, Ivan Vasilievich, the foreman. And when I talked to him, my brain cracked and worked much harder than when I met this Chinese journalist and diplomat. Sometimes he was very simple, but there were things that could not be said. And now, out of nowhere, this frankness in the speech of Wang Yi, which emphasizes the official position of China, which took us 3 years. We will further analyze the molecule of this speech. It's fantastic. How did he do it? He was not drunk. The Chinese do not drink on a large scale. He did not go crazy. He did not take drugs. And apparently this is the consequence of the paragraph that I paid attention to from the New York Post, that something is happening to Xi Jinping, apparently. And there the fight begins, and people fight for power and they show more openly their real positions. And Van Eye was always considered a hawk. There are those diplomats who were temporarily appointed and then filmed with the shame of the position of the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Then they had a very thin diploma in the European Union, and Van Eye, well, this is just, I don't know, this is probably the closest single-minded. Kremlin in the Kremlin leadership. Nevertheless, as the Savcheno Morny Post reports, Van Eye rejected, saying that we cannot allow Russia to lose the war. At the same time, he rejected the accusation that China is providing material support to Russia in the war. They financed the military, insisting that if they gave such support, the conflict would have ended a long time ago. But let us not believe that if now he, Wang Yi, disavowed the official position of China, which he held for 3 years, denying that this war was in the interests of China. Then now it is possible to ignore and doubt that China really does not help and that it inspired this war. We will further analyze why it was necessary to inspire this war. Yes, by the hand, no one has caught China yet, and they would have caught it indeed if there were supplies in real weapon systems. How they caught North Korea right there as soon as they started doing it. But China will provide the help that is appropriate and needed for it in this particular case. Now we will move on to this. Next, Wang Yi made it clear that there is a conviction in Beijing that Washington will soon completely switch all attention to the East. Therefore, China, although it did not ask for this not to happen, China uses the situation. He did not inspire the war of Russia or the aggression of Russia against China. This is what he says, this is not what I say. That is, he clarifies, no, we did not inspire, we did not say Putin, attack Ukraine. But if it happened, then we decided to take advantage of the opportunities in order to delay this war, to involve the United States of America there. Distract their attention from China and let them all go crazy there, let them go crazy. That is, Beijing will be engaged in its affairs in the world while the United States is involved in conflicts in Ukraine. Well, now let's figure out what it means in the big picture. Because here, as Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev said, the dog may have been found. Firstly, from my point of view, the statement of war means that the war in Ukraine, or the aggression of Russia against Ukraine, is a war that China, with the help of its proxy, is leading against. The United States, in order to distract America from China. This is simply the evidence of logic. That is, if he says that we cannot, that this war is in our interests. He is openly talking about it, that this war is in our interests, that the Americans should not come to us. This is a war, the aggression of Russia against Ukraine. This is a war that China is leading by the hands of Putin against the United States. In order for them not to have time and opportunity to pay attention to Southeast Asia and China, this is a hybrid war. And then the question arises whether Putin really came to Xi Jinping on the eve of the aggression, on the eve of the Olympic Games. Whether he came there to put him in a position that we will attack Ukraine, or he came there to get the last order attack. Who is the main? Where was this idea of aggression against Ukraine born? In Moscow or Beijing? This is the main question that arises now in connection with the statement of Wang Yi. China's goal now, as stated in the statement of Wang Yi, for a long time, how can it be longer to involve the United States in confrontation with Russia there, on the battlefields in Ukraine?
на полях сражений в Украине.
thus distracting the attention of America from China on an unsuitable object. We know this operation, the method of achieving this goal. How does China achieve or try to achieve this? The long-term war of the Chinese proxy of Russia, first in Ukraine, and if in Ukraine it ends with the victory of Russia, then that's it. NATO. Now you see, first of all, from the statement of war it becomes clear that Russia is not a sovereign state. So by and large, how they stand out there tell each other half-heartedly in Moscow. Russia is just a proxy of China, which it uses in its interests. That's all actually. Now the second question. All the debates are going on in Europe, in the United States, in America. Let's say, God forbid, Russia wins in Ukraine, it achieves victory. Will it attack or not? Well, now it's clear that it will attack. Because China needs the war to last as long as possible. How long will these wars in Europe first be against Ukraine? Will Ukraine end? It is necessary to start in Europe because it must go as long as this war will last. So many, the United States will be distracted by this war and will be distracted from China. Here is the whole puzzle for you. Therefore, our dear European allies must understand this completely clearly. Now it does not even depend on Putin, it depends on China, from the sky, as they say, on the condition of health of Comrade Xi Jinping. I think that it is, well, Anand really blew up the bomb and gave an exhausting explanation on the most important issues, under which people have been breaking their heads for months, years, at least 3 years. Yes, if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, NATO is the next. The countries of Eastern Europe will be prepared. It does not depend on Putin. He is only a vassal. He is a satellite. He is a proxy. China cannot allow Russia's defeat in Ukraine, but on the other hand, this is not its goal. It is, so to speak, a means of achieving the goal. And the goal is to keep the attention of America and Europe for as long as possible. And for this, it is necessary for the war to continue for a long time, preferably to infinity. Therefore, Beijing does not need Putin's victory in this year, in the next. It is not necessary because the war with NATO will be more difficult for China. With Putin, this is the 10th question, and with Russia, after all, there is nuclear weapons in Europe, independent of American nuclear weapons. It will be more difficult. Therefore, in theory, China is not profitable. Both the defeat of Putin in Ukraine and his victory in Ukraine. Let it last as long as possible. And what should be done for this? Pipe aid. Therefore, the Chinese do not supply a large number of weapons, although they could have their ballistic missiles and everything else. They give him as much as enough, and apparently they give instructions. North Korea and Comrade NA hold back and say, how much can we put in order for Russia to not be able to free its territory in Kursk? Well, it couldn't, the great second army of the world. For this, comrades from North Korea were needed. For this, a large number of ammunition and ballistic missiles were needed. Russia as a proxy of China on the territory of Ukraine, one cannot cope. China immediately uses 2 proxies there. Do you understand what I mean? That is, China leads as it should be from the actions and statements now, from the revelation of the war. China leads there a war against Ukraine. Do you understand? So the goal is to last as long as possible in the United States. That is, to last the war and distract the attention of the United States in America. Russia should not lose, but it is desirable not to win. Let it hang there as long as possible. To do this, it takes a lot of help. And what should the United States do in these conditions?
И что делать Соединенным Штатам в этих условиях?
Well, now it is clear we know you, we have discussed with you for a long time. Okay, the most important enemy of China, that is, the United States, is China.
Соединенных Штатов это Китай.
But before you go there to attack the owner of the house, you need to crush his dog, his hat, the dog from this chain.
Придавить пса его этого цепного.
Otherwise, it will not work. That is, first you need to finish with Pupkin and then deal with the comrades from the underworld. How do you do it? Everything is already ready, in fact. The Americans have a theory of leading the war, well developed, on two fronts, on two theaters, or rather, on two theaters of military action. Well, recently there were hearings, additional analyses were conducted, and they came to the conclusion that it is difficult now in the current conditions, but there is no need to lead a war. Europe has already realized and is ready that Europe, Ukraine, this is the main responsibility of Europe because this is a matter of its own security. It must play a key role, and it took on this role. They took the decision to increase the money. They just need to move faster. Also, the most important thing is to persuade your voter to explain to him, to the hungry Western European citizen, that all this is not a joke, but it is really so. It is necessary to move faster, to produce weapons faster, and to build what they promised. But while this is being built, it is necessary to simply close these holes with the Americans with their reserves on the edge of the Pentagon and to close the sky over Ukraine. That's all. That is, if China does not feel any economic or financial shock from the evidence of the help that Putin is being given now.
Никакого экономического, финансового потрясения от оказания той помощи, которую оказывают Путину сейчас.
Forcing him to wage this war, the proxy war in the interests of China, then what are the problems with the United States? The United States unites its GDP with the European GDP, coordinates the Europeans promised they build. While this will be built, the Americans supply. But the sky needs to be closed. How can you go on? That's all, in fact. That is, you do not have to worry about the Americans. They can safely engage in the provision of the production of the necessary weapons for Ukraine and the orientation of their armed forces on possible conflicts in Southeast Asia. Moreover, what is very important, one does not interfere with the other, because for the European theater, for Ukraine, the types of weapons and ammunition needed are excellent from what is needed in Southeast Asia. There is a need for a fleet, a submarine, and aviation. Here we need land forces, 155mm shells, and everything else for land operations. That's all, actually. Therefore, the only reasonable way out in this situation, about which Comrade Ivan I described in detail, and as a result, apparently, the internal struggle in the Chinese leadership. The United States, together with Europe, must unite, conduct joint actions. The United States, European countries, NATO, or even NATO, Ukraine, for the defeat of Russia. That's all, and for this you don't need to do some miracles. For this, America and Europe should not bring themselves to extinction, to starvation, and to economic collapse. On the contrary, launch the VPC. This is the economy, it is the Russian economy for the last 2 years. They say it is buzzing only due to the fact that some enterprises of the VPC are working, but let them buzz in the United States. In the United States, enterprises of the VPC are mainly located where they are in the Republican states. This is Klondike for the Trump administration. In fact, this is the situation I see. Moreover, we are talking now not about the destruction of the Russian Federation, but about the eviction of the aggressor troops from the occupied Ukrainian territory. That's all. What problems can the Chinese leadership have with such a question? They are officially adhering to the UN Charter, the UN Charter. We are talking about the end of aggression, that's all, not about the defeat of Putin, not about the collapse of Russia. Although, of course, it would be good because it will get rid of the earth ball of this cancerous tumor.
Земной шар от этой раковой опухоли.
But the limited goal, joint operation, eviction of the aggression troops from the occupied territories.
Войск агрессии с оккупированных территорий.
Now even the most firm supporters after the Yastriba, as they are called, the Chinese Yastriba in Washington, after the 1E statement, they must understand that it is possible to completely switch to China only after the defeat of Putin, not the other way around. If you give up now in Ukraine, then China will take Taiwan the next day with bare hands. Understanding that this is not some kind of tiger, but a balloon that can be laughed at, wiped out, no more, no less. That is, America first doesn't even smell here. That is, once again, the United States is capable at the same time to contribute to the defeat of Russia in Ukraine and to prepare for confrontation with China. And in Europe, America can be the second number. The first number will be the European Union, the European wing, NATO. And yes, I have already said that this will give a powerful impulse for the development of the WPK in Western countries. So I would say thank you to Comrade Wang Yi. He has opened his eyes to many, and his revelations must serve as a weighty argument in order for some representatives of the Washington administration to just bring the sky to the ground. And you know, the most important thing is here. What old people are you talking about? What old people are you talking about here? That is, the revolution of the world, the blockade, geopolitics at the highest level, the planetary scale. And at this time, here in Washington, in some heads, cheap deals are flying, and politics is being built in such a way that somehow, how would it be to bite off more money, in billions, but best in tens of billions? This kills, that is, great eras, as some smart people say, do not impress great people thinkers. Well, sometimes these great eras are tragic eras, of course. But now, as it happened all the time, when people like Roosevelt, Washington, maybe, are really needed here in Washington. Even Truman, instead of that, Hexett's Tulsi, this is some kind of nightmare. Well, gentlemen, I hope that this thunderstorm, which is now cracking, continues to crack in Washington. It will be purifying, clean the air here, and all the same, the calamag of American statehood will still lead to a healthy, solid quake. In the meantime, I have to tell you, until this ban on the supply of assistance has been lifted, there have been several events that have been witnessed that they machine system is already working, which cannot be stopped, which I told you about. When there was a threat that the Trump administration would reduce aid, it would stop it. I told you that Ukraine needs integration into the international network, which consists not only of state organizations and institutions, but also of private military. They used to be called military companies, and now it is a symbiosis of a military company with scientific companies, with artificial intelligence companies, which is engaged in production, or they have already practically translated the military business into a new 21st century, where everything is decided not by tanks and not by planes, but by drones on artificial intelligence. Autonomous drones for which GPS is not needed, for which thin fiber threads are not needed, which act on their own, just like in the Pautina operation. So in the beginning, in my opinion, on July 2, the agreement between Ukraine and the American company was signed. The goal of which is production, as Zelensky said, hundreds of Thousands of smart rockets based on artificial intelligence for the armed forces of Ukraine. This is exactly what is needed, and this is done by the American side. One of the leaders in the field of advanced technologies, artificial intelligence, former CEO of Google, Mr. Schmidt, and his company, which until some time ago were, how they were called here, secretive, that is, such confidential companies covered by a whole network of other companies. So as not to dig into them, but somewhere from last year they came out of this veil of secrecy. Well, they will be produced together with Ukraine on the territory of other countries. This is a joint enterprise as one of the forms of work of the Ukrainian VVPK. This is exactly what can break the situation and must save Ukraine in this difficult time from outcasts, from, sometimes, just fools that arise in various capitals, countries, allies. This will give stability, and this will give a technological military advantage in the Soviet Union in the battlefields. So this is one company. I will not name it, how it is called. I will not name how these drones are called and where they will take place. Let others do it if someone wants. This is the first news, the one I liked very much. That is, the speech is going on while Trump is inflating his cheeks and thinking to restore the supplies, not to restore. And if only to restore what, then here the speech is already in the production of hundreds of thousands of these combat units, the effectiveness of which was tested in the operation of the web. I do not mean that it is these drones, but similar drones were used for this purpose. The joint venture will also work between the Ukrainian company and the British company that will produce drones. They will be called Raybirds, but they have already been announced publicly. Therefore, it can be said that it will be produced in Great Britain as part of a new joint venture with Ukraine. That is, Ukraine will be, the Soviet Union will be on the front lines of military technology. I think that the strategy of China, which is not clear why it was now revealed, it will not work. Beijing is still one, China is one, and it opposes the European Union and the United States of America. And this is not equal, I will tell you. That is, the European Union and the United States can cope with China. At the same time, considering that China is not an adventurer country, which, like Putin, can throw itself into senseless events. This is a country that is trying to conquer the world through technology, through economics, through trade. And all these games are being played until it starts to become a danger for its national security. On this note, dear friends, let me finish today's video. As always, glory to the Ukrainian armed forces. The enemy will be defeated, the victory will be ours. To you, dear friends, the endurance of courage and firm faith in our inevitable victory. See you soon.